Good. Okay. Someone had a good question about the papers that you're assigned to do, and should they be research papers, thought papers, and ideally they should be some of both. That is, look at the documents and think about them. On the syllabus, I've posed a number of questions, and I'll keep doing that on the website. And these are meant to guide you in thinking about, how to interpret these things. Like, John Adams and Thomas Paine have different ideas on the role of government. So look at that and think about what their ideas are, and come up with and think about which you agree with or don't. Similarly, when we talk about the ratification of the Constitution, there are lots of people with different ideas, and pick one or two of them and critique their argument. Think about why they're arguing one thing or another. And then other people have mentioned a variety of other issues you could tackle. Looking at the evolution of these ideas of individual liberty would be one thing. Where does all of this come from? Looking at the sources. I'm not expecting you to write, I wouldn't want you to write simply a think piece telling me what you think about this, but instead, thinking about what historically this meant or where this comes from. So that's really what I'm expecting with these. We have some of these issues are still quite alive, and others are less so. Essentially, the big argument still is, individual liberty versus state power, and how do you construct a system which will have power but won't constrain individual liberty? And how do you have individuals with liberty without having simply anarchy? I mean, these are all the questions that are still very much with us, as well as questions about taxation and regulation and other things, which are, of course, quite pertinent, even more pertinent, perhaps. I suppose the question about whether or not Congress should have declared independence is moot. If you want to argue that it was a big mistake, you're welcome to do that. That might be kind of interesting. I'm just now thinking how you would go about doing that. It's good, too, to remember when you're studying history that nothing had to happen the way it did. There are contingencies, there are accidents. Often what I find as I study history is it is the most improbable thing that winds up happening, the least predictable thing. If we were feeding all of this into a computer, it wouldn't come up with a particular outcome because it depends on flawed human beings to carry it out, as opposed to computers which never err. So, think about that. Why does one person disagree with another? I've just been thinking, as I've been thinking about all these ideas on liberty and on the proper role, structure of government. Really, the two figures in this period that to me are the most interesting and whose ideas are the most compelling, I'll tell you right out, are Adams and James Madison. Very similar ideas on the proper structure of government. And the two guys never really liked each other. And it surprised their mutual friend Thomas Jefferson that James Madison and John Adams really didn't get along. And then I've just been thinking about other really improbable relationships. Jefferson was quite close to James Monroe. James Monroe was quite close to John Marshall. And Marshall and Jefferson, to say they didn't get along would be an understatement. They really hated each other. And I don't know. The whole point isn't friendship, personal friendship, and so on. Sorry to think in soap opera terms here. But why does one person come up with one idea about the proper structure of government and someone else, equally reasonable, equally smart, comes up with a different point of view, has a different point of view? I don't know. I'm sure someone here is smarter than I am and would be able to figure this out, tell us something about Madison's upbringing or something. And but yeah, looking at these different issues, which are still very much alive, that's one thing you can do, and think about what the ideas here are. You could look at a document, whether it's the Declaration of Independence or the Pennsylvania Constitution, pick it apart. What's going on here? What's the point of it? I'm not expecting you to, well, you will tell me things I don't know because you're the one looking at this, and I don't know how you think. I'm not expecting you, I don't want to challenge anyone. Often you get into a class and you think you have to really be more brilliant than everyone else in the class. You don't. That's one of the great things about being citizens of this particular country. We all have a stake in what happens here, and all of you have, even if you're not citizens, incidentally, have a right to voice opinion. So do that within reason. Opinions on events of the 1770s, 1780s, or whatever period we're talking about. Okay? Not say, looking at the nullification debate in relationship to the No Child Left Behind Act or something like that would be a little crazy, I think. So try to avoid sounding crazy, too. It's something I struggle with. And any questions on this? Okay. Well, in May of 1776, the Congress, really under John Adams's prodding, adopts a resolution calling on the colonies to form new governments if their old ones have collapsed. And John Adams, who recognized what could be achieved at a particular point, knew this was not independence, but another delegate said, this is a machine for fabricating independence. Once we have created new governments in these colonies, it will be more difficult for British rule to be reestablished. And so what happens in the wake of this, really beginning in June of 1776, is colonies, the provincial assemblies actually, these bodies, you remember the governors had suspended the assemblies in all of the colonies, and these groups of delegates who had been chosen in whatever fashion the colony chose delegates to an assembly continued meeting as a provincial congress and became the de facto government. But then the question arises, what gives them legitimacy to govern? And the Congress tells the colonies to draw up new governments, which will then have the sanction of popular support. And in Virginia, the provincial Congress begins the work of drawing up a new constitution for Virginia. The old charter that, had been granted in the 1620s, or I don't know at what times it had been, re-granted or amended, they agree, has been suspended. It's been broken by the party that granted it. So we have to create a new government. And the new government in structure in Virginia looks very much like the old government. There is an elected assembly. Remember there had been the House of Burgesses. There is a new government now with an elected assembly chosen every year. This assembly gets to choose an upper house or a council which will advise the governor, and then you get into this problem with the governor. Even the very name, governor. In Virginia, they're happy enough to continue calling him the governor, but how do you choose him? It had been easy under the old one. The king chose the governor, and it's unclear who should choose the governor now. So they say, well, how about if the assembly chooses the governor, which they do. The governor, though, will serve for a one-year term. So he will be really created by the assembly. This government, obviously enough, gives power to the assembly, which chooses the governor, and his job is to govern, but also simply to do what the assembly tells him to do. And the one striking feature about the Virginia Constitution, which is worth considering, and it's a striking feature that other states will emulate, is it begins with a declaration of rights. This is the purpose of having a government, to protect rights. And if you look at the state constitutions that are drawn up in this period, and in fact, this is really the most interesting period for creation of constitutions in the history of the country. And sometimes we imagine, or at least those of us who think about it do, and I know at least one of you teaches, we often look at the Articles of Confederation as a rough draft of the Constitution, and it didn't really work, so they came up with the Constitution, which we know and revere today, which is the wrong way to look at it. No one thought about the Articles of Confederation as a constitution, A constitution is a fundamental law, and the Articles of Confederation, which I will talk about in a bit, were created by the delegates from the states, guys appointed by the state legislatures to serve in this Continental Congress. The real work of forming constitutions happened on the state level, beginning with Virginia, with this Constitution, which mainly was the work of George Mason, and creating a system of government for Virginia, so that subsequently there could be a legislature which could pass laws and do all of the things state governments need to do. I should tell you, one person who was really sore that he was not in Virginia to do this important work of drawing up a constitution was Thomas Jefferson. He really felt the work that should be done was happening in Richmond, not in Philadelphia, where he was stuck in June of 1776 writing the Declaration of Independence, when what he really wanted to do was write a constitution for Virginia, because this is where you create a new society in a fundamental law which will govern that state through the rest of its life, or at least until another generation comes along to change it. Mason did write the Constitution for Virginia, and it looked, as I said, very much like the old Constitution, with the exception it has a Declaration of Rights as the reason for doing this, the reason for creating a government, and then the governor is elected by the legislature, serves a one-year term. He's not chosen by the king. Fairly straightforward process. We'll talk more about, particular feature of the Virginia Constitution in a little bit. Pennsylvania has a very interesting process that it's worth thinking about, because Pennsylvania adopts the most radical constitution that has ever been adopted by any American state. And it's the Assembly in Pennsylvania that adopts this. And they're able to do this because the guys in the Pennsylvania Assembly who wanted to remain loyal to the British Crown had left. They either wanted to remain loyal, guys like Galloway, or the Quakers, who couldn't have any part in carrying arms, left. So the real radicals are in charge in the Pennsylvania Assembly, and they drew up a constitution that really is modeled on the proposal Thomas Paine had made in Common Sense. This, incidentally, is also happening in June of 1776 in the Pennsylvania Assembly that meets in the same building as the Continental Congress. They're down the hall. And the Pennsylvania Constitution, Virginia, the Assembly chooses this upper house that advises the governor, also functions as kind of a check on the lower house. Why do you need a check on the lower house? The Pennsylvania Assembly asks when they draw up a constitution. We've done away with these arbitrary checks that have stymied the people. Now you simply have the people governing themselves. Why do they need to be checked? It does begin with a Declaration of Rights, similar to the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Then the government it creates has an assembly. Incidentally, all of these constitutions, the first thing they create is the assembly. And they do that because that's the body that makes the laws. That's the important body. So the assembly comes first. And then the executive officer comes later, and then if there is a judiciary, that comes later. So you'll notice that as you read these things. Now, the assembly is chosen. All of the states, incidentally, had a property qualification for voting. And in all but New Jersey, in fact, they did limit voting to men. And there are reasons for that, which we'll get into later. In fact, you wanted to give the presentation on why women shouldn't vote. Is that right? Okay. I was actually, I have a friend who's a retired politician who keeps advising me to run for office on that platform, that women shouldn't vote, and he wants to see how far we would get. Now, it is limited to men in Pennsylvania. Property qualifications, I won't get into the gender thing right now, but reason for property qualifications. It's not that we rich guys don't want you poor folks voting. Usually the property qualification is a rather limited thing. It's simply that someone has a stake in the society. Remember, voting in many cases is done in a town meeting where everyone sees how you vote. So if we all work for the rich guy here, he's told us how to vote, we all have to stand up to vote. If we stand up the wrong time, he's going to fire us, right? So he's going to tell us how to vote, and we'll all stand up at the right time. You don't want that. Therefore, you limit voting to those who aren't afraid of him, those who are independent of his tyrannical authority, those who have independence and ability to form their own judgment. And you can see, I can see now you're making the connection why women shouldn't vote, because they'll be influenced by their husbands, of course. The same reason children don't vote, they'll be influenced by their parents. So, yeah, limit it to those who have an independent stake in society. That's the reason for it. I'm not saying we should do that now. I can see some of you thinking, but that's why. And also a permanent stake in the society, not just someone who showed up and says, I think this is the way things should be. So you have a property qualification that usually isn't, well, it doesn't exclude most people, because wealth is actually fairly, well, there are degrees of wealth, but most people, at least in Massachusetts, most men are able to meet this property qualification. We'll have more discussion of this later on, because it becomes an issue at the convention in 1787. Anyway, in Pennsylvania, voting was limited to men who had paid a shilling in taxes. Fairly small amount, a shilling a year. But if you were over 21 and a guy, and your father had paid a shilling in taxes, you could still vote, even though you hadn't paid the shilling. So it does extend the suffrage more in Pennsylvania than it's extended anywhere else. Okay? This really makes the Pennsylvania Assembly more the embodiment of a popular will in a broad way than the Assembly anywhere else, because you do have a broader right to vote in Pennsylvania. Now, you only have a one-house legislature. There is no check on what this group wants. Incidentally, they're elected every year, and this is another of these things that you would probably have found on a bumper sticker back then. A guy named James Berg, I think he was Irish, wrote this, that where annual elections end, tyranny begins. So you elect people every year. It's a way of having a turnover in office and a check on what they are doing. So the Pennsylvania Assembly, elected every year, very broad suffrage, and there is not a governor. There is an executive council chosen by this assembly, and presiding over the council is a president. And just think about the difference in the meaning of these two words. This guy governs. This guy presides. Very different idea. You preside over something, you're simply listening to everybody and gathering opinions and keeping time. This guy actually is supposed to be a check, even though in Virginia he's not much of a check on the legislature, since he depends on them to re-elect him if he wants the job. Similarly, the president in Pennsylvania depends on the executive council to choose him, but it's really not much of a job. In the 1780s, for several years, it's held by Benjamin Franklin, who then is in his 80s. So the executive council in Pennsylvania is subject to what the legislature wants. It's not supposed to check the legislature, because the legislature represents all of you. And the legislature, as I said, is elected every year. And before the legislature can do anything, another election has to go by. So what's going to happen is the legislature will pass a lot of laws. The laws will have to be published throughout the state. And then there will have to be another election. So if you don't like what this legislature did, you can vote in a new legislature that can overturn those particular laws that they passed last time. Do you like this, by the way? I mean, it's sounding more appealing. I don't know why. Having a constant turnover. I like the idea of just about everybody getting to vote, and you have this assembly which represents what you people want, and it can, yes, sir.
Wouldn't this get extremely complicated because no one really is long with that?
A good question. Would this get really complicated because no one's in office long enough to make a big change? Well, maybe we don't want big changes. Maybe, but it is going to get complicated because you are going to have change. For example, in 1781, the Pennsylvania Assembly charters a Bank of North America. And this is to help out the Continental Congress because they need to borrow money. So we create a bank. Congress can't charter a bank, but the Pennsylvania legislature can. And it's handy because Congress meets in Philadelphia. The legislature charters a bank. Banks are not popular institutions. Is anyone here a banker? A couple of years ago, I had a banker in class. It was a lot of fun. He since has left banking, incidentally. I don't think it was because of what happened in class. But, banks are not popular institutions because banks control credit. I think we all kind of know this now. And 1785, new legislature says, we don't like this bank. They revoke the charter. So you are going to have a complication. One year, the legislature says, this is what we should do. We need more tax revenue. We should simply take the property of the rich people. By the way, that was kind of the constant refrain in the 1770s and 80s. Rich people versus poor people. Today we think in terms of interests in different ways, but in many ways the differential in the 1770s and 80s was rich versus poor. And in Pennsylvania, the majority is also not rich. Okay, so they'll take property away from the rich folks. Who would like that idea, by the way? Okay, a couple of people say, yeah, let's take the property away from the rich folks. Who would not like that? Okay, it's fairly even, actually. The rest of you are forming the great silent majority. You're not quite sure which way this is going to. I saw 3 and 3 on each side. I know the rest of you didn't come here to debate these big issues or to take a stand on them necessarily. But what would stop the majority from simply saying, okay, why does he need 3 houses? Let's take the 2 of them away and sell them. What would stop us from doing that?
The hope that someday he's going to have 3 houses.
The hope that someday, okay, you might one day have 3 houses. Okay, that's kind of a fugitive hope, perhaps. That's the ultimate thing. By the way, the Pennsylvania Constitution in its Declaration of Rights says private property ought not to be taken. What does that mean? It ought not to be taken.
It shouldn't.
What?
It should not be taken.
Well, it doesn't say it should not be taken. It says it ought not to be taken.
So it could be taken.
It could be. If we really need it, we'll take it. Yeah, we ought not to, but sometimes we just have to do these things. Liberty of conscience ought not to be violated. It doesn't say liberty of conscience must not be violated, should not be violated. Really, we shouldn't do this. But sometimes we have to do these things. We do these things with tears in our eyes. Is that what Marlon Brando said in The Godfather? Anyway, so it has all these things we ought not to do, but there's nothing constraining the majority from doing them, except for one thing. Okay, let's suppose the Assembly decides we need more money. We're taking this guy 2 of his 3 houses and selling them, which incidentally the Assembly does. Under the Pennsylvania Constitution, every 7 years we will elect a Council of Revision, which will consider things the Assembly has done and determine if it has done things it ought not to have done. Okay? Are you happy now, Ignacio, that in 7 years you can come before the Council of Revision and say, well, they ought not to have taken my property? He's happy. Okay. It is going to be a very complicated system. Yes?
What happens if they decide that they did something they shouldn't have done?
Well, then I guess they'd have to give it back.
So they do reverse the decision or something like that? They don't just apologize?
Yeah, they would have to give it back, I guess, and not just say, we ought not to have done that. We're really, really sorry. By then, of course, you 2 guys are living in those houses, so we're going to have to take them away from you, and maybe we ought not to have done that either. Maybe we'll just have to pay him off somehow. This is going to be a big, complicated issue. No one can, well, some people can see ahead and see how this is going to cause big problems. John Adams wrote, when he read the Pennsylvania Constitution, "Good God, the people of Pennsylvania will fall upon their knees to the King of Great Britain to deliver them from the tyranny of their government." So you have Pennsylvania drawing up this very radical constitution in June of 1776. And it's an experience. I don't want to, simply tell you what was a bad thing. It does set off, actually, in motion in Pennsylvania, a contest for the next 15 years about reversing or revoking the Constitution and replacing it. Now, I'm going to talk in a bit about the Massachusetts Constitution. Maybe I should talk now about the Massachusetts Constitution, because it is in many ways the most conservative of these constitutions. I don't like to use words, incidentally, like conservative, liberal, radical. Radical you can use in these terms, but conservative and liberal seem to have a certain meaning today, which they did not have in the 18th century. So if I say the Massachusetts Constitution is conservative, that doesn't necessarily mean Rush Limbaugh is promoting it. And if I say the Pennsylvania Constitution was radical, that doesn't mean, I don't know, Van Jones was the guy in charge. These have quite different meanings in the 18th century, so be careful when we use them. Okay, Massachusetts. Very interesting story here, because what happens in Massachusetts is this. The the provincial Congress that had begun meeting in 1774 and 5 continues meeting, on saying now we are the government of Massachusetts functioning under the 1691 charter, though we don't have a governor. And this goes pretty well until 1777 or so, when tax collectors start showing up demanding money, and also we keep trying to recruit men into the armed forces. Incidentally, and I think by law, everyone who teaches history in the Commonwealth has to mention this, Massachusetts sent more men to the Continental Army during the Revolution than any other state. Okay? And in many ways, it continues to send them up to the end of the war. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean these all were gung-ho guys going off to march. They're getting paid, but getting paid, or the promise of payment, which is something we'll talk about next time, only carries you so far. Anyway, the people start questioning what gives this government legitimacy. Yeah, okay, you say you're operating under the 1691 charter, but that was given by King William III, and the new king said you're all rebels, and you no longer listen to him, so how come you're functioning under this charter that was given by a government you no longer acknowledge? And the bottom line for me as a taxpayer is, why should I pay you anything? Why should I? Anyone have any good answer to this? I don't know. I don't see any reason to. So the Massachusetts Provincial Assembly realizes it needs to do something to establish itself as a legitimate government. So this is what the really smart guys in the legislature do in 1778. They draw up a constitution, and they send it out to the people of Massachusetts to ratify. The people will meet in their town meetings. They will ratify this. That way, this will become the government. And it looks very much like the 1691 government. We will have a governor the Assembly will choose. The Assembly will be deciding on revenues. I don't want to say the Assembly will be raising taxes. That's usually not something they say they're going to do as a promise. And they'll do the other things you need to do as a state government, okay? And you folks will have ratified it in your town meetings. That will give it legitimacy, and we'll get along pretty nicely. The shock comes in the town meetings in 1779 when the people in the towns reject it. They vote against it. They don't like it. I mean, there are different parts of it they don't like. It does not have a Declaration of Rights, which all of the other state constitutions are having now. So that's a big problem. Bigger problem is this. What gives the legislature the power to write a constitution? How can a legislature create a fundamental law that creates the legislature, that controls the legislature? It's an absurdity. And believe it or not, the voters in Massachusetts had an eye then for absurdities, and this was one of them. And also, we elected these guys to do things like deciding what the tax rate should be and where roads should be built, doing the kinds of things the legislature does. Creating a fundamental law is something of a different magnitude. You know, I just think about my own neighborhood. You know, my state rep is really a nice guy, good at doing things you look for a state rep to do. But if I wanted someone to draw up a fundamental law, he's way down on the list of people in the neighborhood I might look to. You know, so had we known this is what you guys were going to do, we might have elected someone else. And writing a constitution is different from just writing a law. It's not something you do along with all of the other pieces of legislative business. So the people of Massachusetts tell their elected representatives the only way to write a fundamental law is by having a body elected specifically for that purpose. And that body will embody the sovereign power of the people of the Commonwealth. You know, it's not just a bunch of guys we've elected because we need a state rep. These are people specifically delegated to do this, not as a provincial Congress or as an assembly, but as a convention. And that's all they do. So, somewhat stung by this, the Massachusetts Assembly says, okay, we'll have a convention specifically chosen just for this purpose. And in the fall of 1779, the people of Massachusetts elect delegates to a constitutional convention. It's actually an idea. They had done this in New Hampshire a year or so earlier, had a constitutional convention that drew up a constitution, and taking the power away from the legislature, because the Constitution creates the legislature. So how can you have the legislature creating itself? I'm sure members of the legislature would like that, but you know, you can't do this. So they do have a constitutional convention. And fortunately for us, I say that because I think they did a pretty good job. You know, there are some arguments against the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. John Adams happened to be home on leave. He had been sent as a diplomat off to Europe, came home in the fall of 1779, got off the boat, learned that the voters in Braintree had elected him to go to this convention, which he did. The convention was held here in Cambridge at the First Church, which stood in Harvard Square, not too far from where we are now. And as Adams said, the convention put him on a committee. The committee put him on a subcommittee, and the subcommittee was himself, Samuel Adams, and James Bowdoin, and the subcommittee put him on a subcommittee of one, and he then wrote a constitution. And once he was done, he actually went back to Europe. The convention then deliberated over it, and it submitted it to the voters in the town meetings, and the voters in the town meetings this time approved it. You know, very important to remember this. The Massachusetts Constitution is created by the people of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It happened to have been written by John Adams, but he recognized he wasn't coming down from on high with tablets, you know, carved by the hand of God. He was embodying the will of the people of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And in the preamble, it talks about the people of Massachusetts covenanting with one another to form a body politic in which each citizen makes a covenant with every other citizen, and all citizens make a covenant with one another. A civil body politic. And it will be called the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And it also has a Declaration of Rights, 30 articles in a Declaration of Rights, which look very similar to the Declarations of Rights you see in other states. But then the really important piece of it is this. You have a legislature with two houses. A lower house elected by the town meetings. For every 150 rateable polls, everyone in Massachusetts pays a poll tax, everyone over 16. For every 150 of them, there will be one representative. And then more for every additional 150 or so. There will be about 300 people in this assembly in Massachusetts. These folks will represent, you know, actually, everyone with an estate that gives them an income of £3 or an estate valued at £60 can vote. It's about $400, I think. If you have $400 worth of property, you can vote, or an annual income of about. It's difficult, just as liberal and conservative have lost their meaning. The value of money in real terms is something difficult for us to decipher. But this essentially is a middle-class group that gets to elect members of the assembly. Okay? In order to be a member of the House of Representatives, you have to have an estate worth £100, and that has to be in the town you represent. It's a way of ensuring that you have a stake in this community for which you are speaking. Also, you want people in state government who have an income of their own and aren't looking at this as a way of getting their hands on the public treasury. Still a very important thing to remember. Believe it or not, some people will do that, use public office as a way of gaining. At least that happened in the 1770s. I don't know if it's happened much today. Okay, so you have this body that represents the middle class. Okay? Recognizing that, as in Pennsylvania, you had this assembly that represented just about everybody, and they had their eyes on Ignacio's property from the beginning, you want another body that will represent the propertied interest. And so for that reason, we create a Senate. And the Senate will have districts determined by tax revenues. So the wealthiest counties, Suffolk County and Essex County, will each have 8 senators. The poorer counties, Bristol County, Barnstable County, will have 1 or 2 senators. And in order to be a senator, you have to have a more significant income. You have to have an estate worth £600, so 6 times what a member of the House has. So what Adams is trying to do here is create a legislature which will balance the interests of the rich against the interests of the poor, but not allowing one to control the other. Later on, he wrote that the great art of law-giving consists in balancing the poor against the rich in the legislature. You don't want to just turn everything over to the rich folks. You also don't want to turn everything over to the poor folks. You need to represent both of their interests. As I said, the House is going to have about 300 to 400 members. The Senate will be smaller. There will be 40 senators. In fact, today, there are 40 senators in Massachusetts. No longer determined by tax revenues, but that's something that has changed. Now, in addition, this problem of a governor. In Virginia, the Assembly chose the governor. In Pennsylvania, you had this executive council. The governor can't be chosen by the Assembly, Adams sees, because then he'll be a tool of the Assembly. He won't be a check on the Assembly. The governor has to be chosen in some other way, and the method Adams finds is to have the governor elected by the people to serve a 1-year term. Okay, so he will represent all of the people of the Commonwealth. Also, to make sure he has independence of the legislature, he has to be a really rich guy. He has to have an estate of £1,000 or more. You don't want a governor, certainly, who sees this as an opportunity to enrich himself. A person of independent means. This is one reason why Massachusetts is one of only 5 states which does not provide a house for the governor, because our assumption is he should be able to afford his own. Okay? By the way, you no longer have to be really rich to be governor, although I understand it does help. So, also, the governor has a veto on what the legislature does. Something the other states won't do. Big problem they had seen was governors vetoing things the legislature did. We don't want a governor to be able to veto things the legislature does. Adams says, what's the point of having a governor then? He wants to give the governor an absolute veto, but the convention says, okay, the legislature can override his veto by a 2/3 vote. So, going on with Adams's thought about balancing the rich against the poor, also, the great art of law-giving consists in constituting the legislative as a perfect balance against the executive power, at the same time that no individual or party can become its rival. The system's not going to work if the legislature and the executive are all the same. You need to have a check on the other. So the essence of a free government, Adams wrote, consists in an effectual control of rivalries. The executive and legislative powers are natural rivals. And if each has not an effective control against the other, the weaker will ever be the lamb in the paws of the wolf. The nation which will not adopt an equilibrium of power must adopt a despotism. There's no other alternative. Rivalries must be controlled or they will throw all things into confusion, and there is nothing but a despotism or a balance of power which can control them. Even in simple monarchies, the nobility and the judiciary constitute a balance, though a very imperfect one, against the royalties. So you create a system where the majority governs through this system of a balance, but Adams sees if the governor and the legislature aren't checking one another, you have a despotism. And if one can't check the other, the weaker one will be the lamb in the paws of the wolf. I think a succession of our governors have found this out to their peril, that they think I'm the governor, but actually the legislature is the one calling the shots. So you have a problem here, which Adams tries to work out by having a Senate representing the rich folks, the House representing the poorer folks, or the common folks, and a governor who can check both. Plus, you do have a judiciary. Not much said about it, although in the Declaration of Rights, another thing I should mention too, under the old charter, there was a governor's council to advise the governor, and not quite sure what else to do with it. The new Constitution of 1780 also has a governor's council, and we still do have a governor's council. Does anyone here know anyone on the governor's council? No one's quite sure what exactly they do, but there they are. So I don't want to offend anyone, but I just want to point out we do have a governor's council. They get to vet judicial appointments and decide if the governor should pardon someone. Okay. The Declaration of Rights is very similar to the other declarations of rights, with one very important difference. The last one, Article 30, says that the executive shall never exercise legislative or judicial powers. The legislature shall never exercise executive or judicial powers. The judiciary shall never exercise executive or legislative powers. Okay? So the legislature can't enforce the law or pass judgment on laws. The governor can't make laws or decide cases, and the judiciary can't make laws or enforce the law. To the end that this will be a government of laws and not of men. So the Constitution of Massachusetts mandates a separation of powers among these branches of government, because otherwise you don't have a government of laws, you have a government of men. Okay, little guys in the legislature, guys in the court decide we'll do something differently, or we'll go along with what the other branch wants, and this way, this breeds, well, despotism is the word Adams kept throwing around. Of course, in the 1770s, this notion of government of laws was the definition of a republic. So, any questions on this? Yes?
It seems like, there's a period of like 4 or 5 years in which these constitutions are being made throughout the colonies. What is Britain doing during that time?
What is England doing in terms of what?
With the colonies.
Okay, good question. Very good question. During this period, the colonies are coming up with constitutions. What is Britain doing? Britain's sending an army and a navy here to suppress the rebellion. Okay. Unsuccessfully. not to get us into the whole history of what's happening, but different colonies are occupied at different times. After March of 1776, in fact, March 17th, 1776 to be exact, the British troops leave Massachusetts and never come back. That's why we celebrate Evacuation Day. Okay, so Massachusetts, can create this government with some leisure, but the British are occupying New York. In 1777 and 78, they occupy Philadelphia. They have an army that actually is moving through South Carolina. South Carolina draws up a constitution, and recognizing that they could be invaded at any moment, they create, during times of emergency, you can have the legislature appoint someone to be dictator, which they do in 1778. John Rutledge becomes the dictator of South Carolina. So you have the British are trying to recapture the colonies, realizing it's not going to work. Also, after 1778, France and Spain declare a war on England, so then England has this war on the continent and in the Caribbean to worry about as well. And British public support for winning the war wanes. Particularly after Yorktown in 1781, when Washington captures this British army. So you have, the British maintaining that, and in fact, when they do occupy Philadelphia, this is their opportunity to show we can create a government here that people will rally around. They appoint Joseph Galloway to be the governor of, Philadelphia. It doesn't really work out for him. They occupy New York, so the rest of New York has this government that's created. They create a constitution, but New York City is occupied until November of 1783. And so there are British troops throughout the colonies, except in New England. They do have series of, British and their German allies, or German mercenaries, marched through New Jersey twice, and New Jersey had been relatively loyal until the Hessians marched through and really helped to dissuade or lose the hearts and minds of the people of New Jersey. So, the English aren't watching and saying, great, they're forming constitutions. If the British were able to reestablish control, all of this would have been just a parlor game. What kind of governments did they create when they had a chance? And the government of Pennsylvania, is subject, you have the British occupying Philadelphia and British troops in different parts of Pennsylvania in 1777-78. It's a military campaign that's going on, a series of military campaigns. And the British don't recognize American independence until 1783. But all of this would have been a moot point had the British been able to reestablish control. I'm not sure if this answers your question, but they're not studying this intently, saying, boy, what would be the ideal form of government? These Americans must know. I don't know if people in England spent much time thinking, these are interesting questions that kind of get us away from the subject at hand. We can talk more about the British Constitution and how it changes in the 19th century later on. Any other questions? Okay, I had lots more interesting things I was going to say, but I have a sense that perhaps you've had enough for tonight. I'm happy to stay here. I could go on all night talking about this. We could try this as an experiment. I'll close my eyes and keep talking and see who is still here. Why don't we call it a night, and next time we'll get back to this other really interesting stuff I was going to tell you tonight.